On the morning of 8th December 2001, at the 8 Wellington Panmure RSA on Queen's Road, in Panmure, Auckland, the sign-in book recorded another ordinary start to the day. Inside, Club President Bill Absalom, member Wayne Johnson, cleaner Mary Hobson, and part-time accountant Susan Couch began their routines, unlocking doors, preparing tills, cleaning floors. At around 8 a.m., CCTV timestamps and cash register data would later mark a narrow window in which everything changed. A former employee, William Dwane Bell, recently fired from the club, walked back through the door carrying a shotgun concealed in a guitar case. By late morning, emergency calls were logged and the first crime scene photographs were taken. 3 people were dead. 1 was barely alive. At the time, police and paramedics saw what appeared to be a violent robbery gone catastrophically wrong. Only later, as officers pieced together Bell's extensive criminal history, parole records, and prior warnings, would investigators understand how many systems had already failed before this morning began. The 8 Wellington Panmure RSA occupied a modest building on Queen's Road in Panmure, a working-class suburb of Auckland. Like hundreds of returned and services associations across New Zealand, it served as a social club for veterans and their families, a place for quiet drinks, conversation, and community gatherings. Nothing about it suggested vulnerability to extreme violence. On the morning of 8th of December 2001, the club opened according to its usual schedule. Bill Absalom, the club president, arrived early to oversee operations. He was 73 years old, a respected figure in the local community who had dedicated years to the RSA and its members. Wayne Johnson, 5049, was a club member present that morning. Mary Hobson, 64, worked as the cleaner, maintaining the premises as she had done countless times before. Susan Couch, the part-time accountant, arrived to handle the club's financial paperwork. In testimony she would later provide, Couch described the morning as quiet and ordinary, the kind of routine start that left no reason for concern. Staff movements that morning followed predictable patterns. Doors unlocked, lights switched on, tills prepared for the day's transactions. Each step of their routine would become a crucial time marker for investigators reconstructing what happened next. By the time the morning was fully underway, every ordinary action had already become part of an investigative timeline that no one yet knew would be needed. William Dwane Bell was released from Auckland Prison in July 2001 under New Zealand's automatic release provisions. At the time, prisoners serving determinate sentences were released after completing 2/3 of their term, regardless of rehabilitation progress or assessed risk level. Bell had been serving time for aggravated robbery, an offence in which the victim had nearly been killed. Upon release, Bell was assigned to the Panmure probation office for supervision. His parole conditions were specific and detailed. He was required to attend sessions with a psychologist, participate in alcohol and drug counselling, and obtain approval for any employment. These conditions existed because Bell had been assessed as presenting significant risk. The conditions were never enforced. Subsequent investigations would reveal that Bell attended virtually none of his required appointments. He took employment without informing his probation officer. The supervision that was supposed to monitor a high-risk violent offender existed largely on paper. Police officers who later reviewed Bell's file would describe him in stark terms. One investigator called him the closest thing I have ever seen to a psychopath, a characterization based on Bell's documented history of violence, manipulation, and complete absence of remorse across more than 100 prior convictions. Bell's criminal record stretched back years and included multiple violent offences. The system had encountered him repeatedly. Yet in the months following his July 2001 release, the mechanisms designed to prevent reoffending by high-risk individuals failed at nearly every level. On paper, the system was supervising him. In practice, it was barely watching. Sometime in late 2001, Bell obtained work at the Wellington Panmure RSA through a work experience arrangement. The position placed him behind the bar and around the club's daily operations, its cash handling, its routines, its layout, and its vulnerable morning hours when few people were present. Bell never informed his probation officer about the employment, a direct breach of his parole conditions. The violation went undetected. His time at the RSA was brief. Staff who worked alongside Bell later described him as abusive, rude, and untrustworthy, someone whose behavior made the club environment uncomfortable. The RSA terminated his employment and told him, in blunt terms recorded in later testimony, to piss off and not return. The firing was straightforward workplace management, an unsuitable employee removed from a community establishment. No one at the RSA had reason to know Bell's full criminal history or parole status. They saw a difficult worker. They ended the arrangement. What the termination created, however, was something investigators would later reconstruct with painful clarity. Bell now possessed detailed knowledge of the club's interior layout, its cash handling procedures, its staffing patterns, and its morning routine when security was minimal and few witnesses would be present. The RSA had done what any employer might do with a problematic worker. In doing so, they had unknowingly provided a high-risk offender with reconnaissance for a future crime. When the RSA cut ties with Bell, it closed one door as an employer and unknowingly opened another as a future crime scene. In the weeks before December 2001, Bell's behavior escalated in ways that left clear traces across Auckland's law enforcement records. In November 2001, Bell was involved in an assault case that resulted in police contact. Around the same period, staff at an engineering firm and a local tavern reported thefts, stolen goods and cash missing under circumstances that pointed directly to Bell. The victims and witnesses did not struggle to identify the suspect. They provided police with Bell's name, his address, his phone number, and his car registration plate. The information sat in police files. The offences were classified according to standard priority frameworks. Proceedings to return Bell to prison for parole violations were not initiated. This was not a case where an offender had evaded detection. Bell was visible, his name appearing in multiple recent reports, his pattern of theft and violence documented, his parole conditions providing legal grounds for recall to custody. The mechanisms for intervention existed, yet the gap between documented risk and institutional action remained open. Families of the RSA victims and survivor Susan Couch would later ask the question that investigators themselves could not easily answer. How many chances did the system have to stop William Bell before December 8th? By early December, Bell was already on police radar. The problem was not that no one saw him, it was that nothing stopped him. On the morning of 8th of December 2001, William Bell arrived at the Wellington Panmure RSA, carrying a shotgun concealed inside a guitar case. He wore a shirt resembling a police uniform, a detail later established through witness accounts and crime scene evidence. Outside, in a vehicle parked nearby, waited Darnell Kerr Toop. Toop would later provide statements to police describing his role. He had driven Bell to the RSA and waited while Bell went inside. He knew a robbery was planned. Bell entered the club during the vulnerable morning window when few staff were present and the premises had not yet opened to general membership. Susan Couch would later recount being persuaded to unlock a door for Bell, a decision made in the ordinary course of workplace routine, with no reason to anticipate what followed. What happened inside the RSA over the next approximately 45 minutes would be reconstructed through forensic evidence, survivor testimony, and Toupe's subsequent statements. Bell did not simply commit robbery. The Crown's later case summary would establish that he spent roughly 15 minutes on the theft itself, taking cash, cigarettes, and wallets totaling approximately $13,000, and around 30 minutes on assaults of extreme brutality. By the time Bell left the building and returned to Toupe's waiting vehicle, 3 people were dead: Bill Absalom, Wayne Johnson, and Mary Hobson. Susan Couch, severely injured, was barely alive. The RSA's quiet morning had become one of New Zealand's worst crime scenes. The discovery came later that morning, when someone, accounts vary on precisely who, found the scene inside the RSA and called emergency services. Responding officers and paramedics arrived to find devastation. Paramedic Pam Neal would later describe what she encountered in terms that conveyed the severity without dramatization. Susan Couch had lost what Neal estimated as almost 80% of her blood. Couch was initially thought to be dead. Only faint signs of life indicated she might be saved. The injuries across all 4 victims were catastrophic. Forensic examination would later confirm that a shotgun had been used, consistent with the weapon Bell had carried into the building. Additional injuries showed evidence of blunt force trauma. Victims had been beaten as well as shot. First responders established a perimeter around the RSA. The building transformed from a community club into a secured crime scene. Initial photographs documented the positions of victims, the locations of blood evidence, and the overall state of the interior. Emergency call logs recorded the timestamps. Medical teams worked to stabilize Couch for transport. Police officers began the systematic process of controlling access to the scene and preserving everything inside for forensic examination. What began as a medical emergency was, within minutes, classified as a triple homicide and attempted murder. The beginning of one of the most intensive investigations Auckland police had conducted. The interior of the Emmett Wellington Panmure RSA presented investigators with a complex crime scene requiring meticulous documentation. Standard procedure for a scene of this severity involved zoning, dividing the space into defined areas, each processed systematically, to ensure no evidence was overlooked or contaminated. Crime scene photographers moved through the building, capturing images that would later anchor the Crown's case. Every surface, every blood pattern, every item out of place was logged and catalogued. Forensic specialists conducted blood spatter analysis to reconstruct the sequence and locations of attacks. Ballistic examination confirmed the use of a shotgun and documented the wounds consistent with that weapon. The blunt force injuries, severe head trauma evident across multiple victims, were catalogued separately, indicating that the assaults had involved both firearm and physical beating. One detective who worked the scene would later describe it as among the worst of his career. The statement was factual rather than dramatic. The nature of the violence and the vulnerability of the victims made the RSA case exceptional, even for experienced homicide investigators. The forensic process took hours. Every potential fingerprint location was examined. DNA evidence was collected where present. The positions of cash drawers, the state of the till, and the items taken all contributed to understanding both the robbery and the extended period of violence that had accompanied it. Before investigators could ask who did this, they had to ensure every trace of how it happened was preserved. The identification of William Bell as the primary suspect came with unusual speed, driven by the convergence of multiple existing records. RSA staff who had survived or who knew the club's recent history immediately provided investigators with a name: the former employee who had been fired months earlier. Bell's termination was documented. His behavior during employment was remembered. More significantly, police discovered that Bell's name already appeared in their own recent files. The November thefts, from the engineering firm, from the tavern, had generated reports where victims provided Bell's identifying details: the same name, the same physical description, the same pattern of targeting workplaces where he had some connection or knowledge. The investigative question was not who, but rather how the existing information would support prosecution. Darnell Kerr Toop, the getaway driver, provided crucial statements to police. He described waiting outside the RSA while Bell was inside, and he recounted what Bell had said upon returning to the vehicle. According to Toop's account, Bell told him, "We're going down for this. I just killed 3 people." Toop's evidence established both Bell's direct admission and the premeditated nature of the crime. Bell had arranged transportation, arrived armed and disguised, and targeted a location whose vulnerabilities he knew from personal experience. Within days of the murders, the investigation had a name, an address, and a documented history. The next step was arrest. 5 days after the RSA murders, police located William Bell at his mother's home in Mangere, South Auckland. The arrest was documented in standard procedural terms. Officers arrived at the address, identified Bell, and took him into custody without significant incident. He was cautioned, transported to the station, and formally charged with 3 counts of murder, 1 count of attempted murder, and aggravated robbery. Among the items seized from Bell's vehicle, investigators found newspapers featuring front-page coverage of the RSA killings. Bell had kept a copy of the New Zealand Herald reporting on his own crimes, a detail noted in press coverage and consistent with the psychological profile that investigators and later court officials would develop. At the police station, Bell was processed through standard booking procedures. The evidence against him was already substantial: survivor testimony from Susan Couch, statements from Tooper, forensic evidence from the scene, and the documented history that connected him to the RSA through his prior employment. The arrest marked the transition from investigation to prosecution preparation. Everything discovered at the scene, every statement collected, every forensic result obtained would now be organized for presentation in court. The suspect was in custody, but the case would depend on more than a name and a history. It would rest on evidence that could withstand cross-examination, challenge, and the scrutiny of a jury. Reconstructing precisely what happened inside the RSA required investigators to layer multiple evidence streams into a coherent timeline. Forensic pathology reports established causes of death: shotgun wounds and severe blunt force trauma to the head. The injuries were consistent with sustained, deliberate violence rather than the chaotic panic of a robbery interrupted. Medical documentation of Susan Couch's injuries, severe head trauma resulting in stroke and permanent disability, confirmed the brutality extended to the survivor. Cash till data provided timestamps that helped bracket the duration of Bell's presence in the building. Combined with witness statements and Toupe's account of waiting outside, investigators determined Bell had spent approximately 45 minutes inside, far longer than a simple robbery would require. Toop's statements added context about Bell's state before and after the crime. According to Toop, Bell had used methamphetamine and cannabis. Whether this contributed to the extended violence became a question for court consideration. Susan Couch's own statements, given as her medical condition allowed, described Bell's movements and actions from the perspective of someone who witnessed the attacks and survived only because Bell apparently believed she was already dead. The reconstruction painted a picture not of robbery complicated by resistance, but of planned violence that used robbery as partial motive. The time spent on assault relative to theft suggested purposes beyond financial gain. Piece by piece, investigators could show what happened inside the RSA, but not yet why the system had let it happen at all. As Bell awaited trial, attention turned to the documented failures that had preceded the RSA murders. Bell's criminal history was extensive. More than 100 prior convictions spanning years of offending. The record included violent crimes, theft, and, most significantly, an earlier aggravated robbery in which the victim had nearly been killed. This was not an offender whose risk was ambiguous or difficult to assess. The parole conditions imposed upon his July 2001 release had been designed to address that risk. Psychological treatment, substance abuse counseling, employment oversight, each requirement existed because professionals had identified Bell as dangerous. None had been enforced. Media investigations ran parallel to the legal proceedings, documenting the gaps in supervision that had allowed a high-risk offender to operate unchecked for months. The coverage transformed the RSA case from a crime story into a broader examination of how parole management had failed. Susan Couch, dealing with permanent disabilities resulting from the attack, began what would become a years-long civil action against the Department of Corrections. Her argument was direct. The department's failure to supervise Bell as required had exposed her and the other victims to foreseeable lethal risk. The legal distinction between criminal prosecution and civil liability would play out over years. But by the time Bell's trial approached, the RSA murders were no longer just a case of individual violence. They had become an indictment of institutional failure. William Bell's trial took place in the High Court at Auckland across 2002 and 2003. The Crown's case presented the evidence systematically. Forensic findings, survivor testimony from Susan Couch, statements from Tupper describing Bell's admissions, and the documented history that established motive and premeditation. Bell had known the RSA's layout, its routines, and its vulnerabilities. He had arrived armed and disguised. He had spent far longer inside than robbery required. Bell took the stand in his own defense and, according to court records, lied repeatedly. His accounts contradicted established evidence. His attempts to minimize his role collapsed under cross-examination. The presiding judge's remarks upon conviction characterized the crimes in terms that reflected their severity. The judge described calculated wickedness and evil, language that captured both the premeditation and the gratuitous violence that had extended well beyond any criminal purpose. Darnell Kerr Toop was convicted separately on 3 counts of manslaughter and aggravated robbery. His role as knowing getaway driver made him legally culpable even though he had not entered the building or directly participated in the killings. Families of Bill Absalom, Wayne Johnson, and Mary Hobson provided statements to the court. Susan Couch, still dealing with severe medical consequences, was present for portions of the proceedings. Bell displayed no remorse, a fact noted explicitly in judicial observations. The jury's verdict closed one chapter in the RSA case, but the sentence would open new debates about punishment and prevention. In February 2003, William Bell received a life sentence, with a minimum non-parole period initially set at 33 years. At the time, a record for New Zealand. The period was later reduced to 30 years on appeal, but Bell remained classified among the country's most dangerous offenders. Darnell Kerr Toop received 12 years for his role, with subsequent parole decisions governing his eventual release. Susan Couch's civil case against the Department of Corrections continued for years, ultimately resulting in a settlement that acknowledged, without full admission of liability, the failures in Bell's supervision. The case contributed to ongoing policy discussions about parole management and the handling of high-risk offenders. The families of the victims, Absalom, Johnson, Hobson, carried losses that no legal outcome could address. Their statements, preserved in court records and media coverage, documented grief compounded by the knowledge that multiple intervention opportunities had been missed. The Emmet Wellington Panmure RSA continued operating after extensive refurbishment. The building that had witnessed such violence returned to its function as a community club, though those who remembered December 2001 could never see it quite the same way. Each year on 8th of December, the club observes a quiet commemoration. The date that began as an ordinary Saturday morning has become part of institutional memory, a reminder of what happened and of the people who were lost. The RSA interior, now functional and quiet, holds no visible trace of that morning, but the record remains. Timestamps, photographs, testimony, verdicts. On 8th of December each year, the club remembers the morning when routine stopped and the record began.